Now, we know the five competitive forces defined by Michael Porter. So let's go into one by one. But just to reiterate, the new entry, how comfortable is the entry for a new player in a particular industry? Power of supplier, buyer, what is the substitutability of the product, and what is the kind of competition that is existing. Now this is what will define the industry structure, and we need to understand that the industry structure is what will drive the competition. Depending on how the industry structure is, competition and profitability can very well be assessed. So we really need to understand this framework so that I can position the company in a much effective manner. I can plan my business in a much effective manner. I can assess the future worthiness of the business in an effective manner. So it will provide me a good insight into why a particular industry is profitable, what is contributing to the profitability of the industry, and how is the competition going to change over time, how is the profitability going to change over time. So we can get a better assessment of the industry by doing this. And the more and more I'm focusing on these five factors, I'll get a good understanding of the industry structure, profitability, competition, which will help me in valuing a company or valuing a particular business quite effectively. And it reveals the most significant aspects of the competitive environment, and it also helps me in assessing one single company's strengths and weaknesses so that I can really plan out the valuation aspect with respect to the strength and weaknesses of the company. Now let's go one by one. Threat of new entry. So we are talking about here the entry barriers, how strong they are, how comfortable is it for a new player to enter into a particular industry. So that is what we are trying to understand through this dimension. So any new firm that comes into the market, it is bringing in additional capacity, right? Because it wants to produce more, sell more, and because new firms are coming in, they want to gain some kind of a market share. And the more market share they want to gain, it will put pressure on the existing firms. Probably their profits may get impacted. So a good understanding of why the new firms are getting in. Is it a new market is getting created, or the new entries trying to gain the market share from the existing firm, so the profitabilities of the existing firms are getting impacted. So that's one side we need to understand. Then look at the barriers to entry. If at all more and more barriers are created for entry of new firms, that's an advantage for the existing firms. The more and more, let's say now there are already 5 players in a particular industry. Now, if they create the barriers in such a way that the 6th firm cannot enter into it, then it's an advantage to these 5 firms which are already existing in that industry. But if the 6th, 7th, 8th firms enter, there is a possibility that they are going to eat away the market share of these 5 firms, and even the profitability of these 5 firms will be at stake. So how can these companies create a barriers to entry? So some different dimensions where the barriers to entry can be created. So try out from the perspective of supply side economies of scale. Now existing firms spread their fixed costs. Economies of scale. The larger you produce, the cheaper it would be costing you. The input cost will become cheaper and cheaper with the volume that you are producing. Now, existing firms can very well spread their fixed costs if they are producing more number of units. So, average cost per unit is coming down. So, which means the new firms, either when they are starting, they have to start with this much large production, because now the economies of scale made the average cost per unit lesser for established firms because they are producing in large numbers. So either the new firm has to go with that kind of a production the moment it starts. So the large scale is what it has to start with, or it has to accept the cost disadvantage and probably try focusing on other aspects. It can't focus on the price aspect because the costs are much cheaper for established firms because they were able to establish the economies of scale. Similarly, there is a possibility of creating a barrier by working on the demand side benefits of scale, which is what we call as network effect. From the customer's perspective, you create the product in such a way that as more and more customers increase, as the word of mouth increases, as the goodness of the product increases, the customers are ready to pay a premium for the company's product. Because of the network that you have created, the word of mouth that you have created, customers are willing to shell out even a little bit of additional premium, and which means for a new company it becomes difficult in terms of maintaining the profitability because they can't charge a similar price because they did not get the customer base, and they are forced to sell at a much cheaper price, which will impact their profitability in the short run at the beginning of the business. So it may prevent them from entering into the industry quite comfortably. Similarly, customer switching costs. Now, probably if I look at it like this, I have, let's say, installed one proprietary software from a vendor X. Now I did not like it. I have to switch myself to another proprietary software from a vendor Y. But if I say if I have to uninstall this and install this, it's going to be a heavy cost. Then it's very much likely that I will prevent the kind of a switching from one to the other. So the new customers may find it, or switching to a new vendor will become a very expensive task for the buyers, which means I can't have any new firms coming into this business because already existing firm, they find it very difficult. I have created a barrier where the customers find it very difficult to switch. So the cost that the buyer can incur when they change the suppliers, the more and more are the switching costs, they act as barriers. So the customer will not look at the possibilities of switching. So more and more they can prevent the new firms from entering into the business. Similarly, the capital requirements. If they are very large, probably the initial capital to enter into a particular industry, if it is much large, then only few players can afford to enter into that particular industry. So a heavy barrier is created. But again, that may not be the only criteria, because at the end of the day, if the prospects of that business are much better and people expect that this prospects are going to continue, the industry is going to perform well in the next few years, even if the capital requirements are large, potential entrants can still enter into that business and even the capital can still keep flowing into that kind of a business. So, but at least to some extent, the capital requirement can act as an entry barrier. Similarly, there could be other incumbency advantages for the existing. They must have, by now, the existing firms, they must have really got into some kind of economies of scale. They might have optimized their cost. They might have planned something on their quality. They must be already executing something on the quality over the new firms. So they must have already got some kind of experience in the business. So they know how to produce the best quality at a lowest cost. They must have created a brand for themselves. So they must have gotten access to the best raw material sources. All these things could definitely give some kind of an advantage to the existing firms, which means the new firms, when they are entering into this kind of a business, they have to really find ways to overcome all these advantages. Otherwise, they will not be successful. So, all these will act as barriers to entry for the new firm. Then, unequal access to the distribution channels. There is a possibility that the existing firms might have tied up with all the distribution channels, all the existing branded distribution channels, they must have already tied up. Now, if a new firm is entering, probably either it has to find ways to tie up with the existing channel, or it has to come out with its own kind of distribution channel, which will be more and more costly for the newer firm. So finding alternatives or creating the own kind of distribution channel becomes an additional cost and probably a non-efficient way of doing the allocation. So it may prevent even the new firms from entering into the industry as such. And more importantly, depends on the government policy. The more and more restrictive the policy is, more licensing requirements, heavy capital requirements, right? And if the government has put any kind of restrictions on foreign direct investments, FIIs, if they are not allowed to participate in the business, or if there are limitations with respect to the foreign investments in the business, obviously the growth is going to be hampered. The entry of the new players is going to get hampered. More and more safety regulation, more and more restrictive the government policy is, it can virtually act as a barrier of entry for the new players. But on the other side, if they give more and more subsidies, or if they are doing some kind of indirect funding, then it is more and more pro new entry. They are acting more and more in favor of new players entering into the market. But if they are reducing these subsidies and this, the government is virtually acting as a barrier, is creating the platform for new barriers to entry for anyone to enter into this kind of a business. And when new firms really find that the existing firms are having a strong negative reaction, are agitating, are not willing the entry of the new firms into the business. Generally, if you see in the past, if the existing firms have retaliated vigorously, they literally did not allow the new firms to enter into the business. Strong agitation for a new firm to enter into a particular business. Then new firms will not show much of an interest to enter into that particular business. And especially if the existing firms have enough resources to fight back. They have excess capacity already, which means they can produce more at a much cheaper cost. They have unused borrowing sources, so they can raise capital at a much cheaper cost. Right? They already have got the approvals for the additional capital, but they did not raise it. so they can raise it at a much cheaper cost and increase the production. They have a significant hold over the distribution channels. They can very well prevent the new firms to access these distribution channels, so they can resort to all these means, which means probably the new firms will not show much of an interest to enter into this kind of a business. And they can very much do a lowering of the prices. They have the ability to do that. They have the willingness to do that. So they can very much reduce the price and probably knock off the new firms that are entering. Make the situation so tough for the new firms that they don't even dare to enter into this kind of a business. So they can very well retain their market share and not lose them to the new firms. If that's the case, there is no point in the new firms trying to enter into that kind of a business. And finally, if the industry growth is very slow, which means if a new firm has to enter into that particular industry, it has to eat away the market share of the existing players itself. And in that case, it becomes very tough for a new player to enter into the business, because it has to take the market share from the existing players and it is not able to create a new market for itself. The first one is much more difficult rather than creating a new market and trying to take a hold of that new market. So, the moment you see that any of these things is occurring, it's always better that the new firms better stay off from entering into that kind of an industry.